third part of our workshop and live stream here. And the third part is about how to memorize a textbook realistically. Really looking forward to it. Anthony?
Well, before I start, thanks again for all the great questions from the last session. They're fantastic, and keep them coming. And really, I called this How to Realistically Memorize a Textbook, because a lot of people email me and ask me about textbook memorization. They ask me about entire book memorization. And I get a little bit concerned by this, because verbatim memorization has a place, but for this particular audience of you as students who are hoping to be A-plus students, I really don't know that memorizing an entire textbook is practical or desirable or even really necessary. So the best way to memorize a textbook realistically is really to not memorize a textbook. I think that this is sort of counterproductive, because you're never going to be asked to recount it in the first place. You're going to be asked to recount particular elements from it, and you want to be able to understand what those elements are and reproduce those most important things and have good command of them. And as one of the questions from the last session suggested, turn them into knowledge so that it's not just information. And if you memorize an entire textbook, that's what it's basically going to be, is information. And you will have some knowledge, but there's much better ways. So I really would recommend not to think about memorizing a whole textbook unless you're in some sort of memory championship or there's $1 million prize or something of this nature, because I don't think it's the quickest path to student success. So what we want to really think about is my particular story with juggling hundreds of books. And I've always really liked this image that I took. I was at the University of Toronto. I was very blessed to actually have my own study carrel, and I was able to bring books into this place and store them there so other people couldn't get them. And I was bringing entire piles of books. And I want to tell you exactly what I did in order to strategically study these books and to prepare to have them in memory, the key points, the most important material in memory palaces, so that I was prepared to write, prepared to recall this information in extraordinarily stressful situations, such as my field exams, were 2 of those, and my dissertation defense. The field exams have 7 professors each, which are different people each time. Well, there's a core group that's the same, but other people come in as we go along. And then, of course, the dissertation defense is very, very intense, because you have what's called external, which means someone who comes from outside of the department that you're studying in, but also outside of the university. So you have someone coming in from the United States, in my case, and a very, very distinguished scholar indeed. And so I wanted to be prepared. And as I said in the webinar, it's one of the high points of my whole existence as a scholar was when he said that the only person cooler than I was Miles Davis. And that was just, even though I'm not so greatly familiar with Miles Davis, I just thought, that's cool. And that was really neat. And the reason why he said that is because I was bopping stuff off like it was nothing, and I was super relaxed about it. And he said that most people, they go to a dissertation, they're freaked out, they're nervous, and he's even encountered people who couldn't speak and even broke down in tears and couldn't defend their dissertation and needed to come back a different time, which of course is very stressful because people are flying in, the externals, and there's costs involved. And you also have spent years and years of your life getting to the stage where you're going to defend a dissertation, and it's a huge thing. And if you were to fail that, it would be like falling off Mount Everest or something like that. So it was a huge thing for me. And if I had had this stuff earlier, when I was at the very beginning of my university career, I probably would have, been Doogie Howser or something like that. I don't know if Doogie Howser is a show that people know anymore, but one of these wonder kids who is just basically super advanced. But we just have to work with what I have. But piles of books like this can be mastered, can be put in your mind, and can be just wonderfully accessible. But I really wouldn't think so if it was verbatim. It would take too much time. But in a relatively short period of time, 30 points from each of these books is very, very accessible and easy, and even many more. So this is just a fun picture for me from the University of Toronto, where I had a personal study carrel to work on this stuff. And if you can't have a personal study carrel, then you can make personalized space for yourself, and that's a very good thing to do, is have dedicated spaces to work in and to keep as sort of holy territory that's just for studying. So what I really want to do is kind of move away from memory palaces for just a moment and join us to another magical device, which is the index card, and talk about how to prepare them in very specific ways so that they're well suited for translating, so to speak, or transporting, teleporting into memory palaces. And one of the reasons why index cards are so magical is because they're, actually we'll just go back for a second, they are information storage and retrieval devices. And that's actually what memory palaces are too. Information storage and retrieval device is not so sexy, but index card is and so is memory palace. But I really, really want to stress that there's a process of using index cards that doesn't have to be random. It doesn't have to just be sort of writing stuff on index cards and then shuffling through them later. You can prepare and predetermine books and index cards so that you're using them in very, very strategical ways. And one of the ways that you do this is that you take a book and you examine the book as an object, and you decide in advance how that you're going to actually study that book by looking at how many chapters it has, thinking about how much information that you want to memorize from each chapter, setting aside a number of index cards precisely for that purpose. Of course, you want to have extra index cards that, in case there's some extra point that you want to add. But if you actually become very not religious, let's say, but you build a constraint around yourself and decide that you're only going to memorize 30 pieces of information from a book or 10 pieces of information from a chapter, you're going to do far more than if you go in there with the mindset that you're going to memorize the whole thing or that you're going to memorize every single point. And the reason why is because you need to give your mind the ability to fill in the blanks, right? And so if you have a strategical method of actually putting posts in front of you, this is just in terms of knowledge gathering at this point, not necessarily memorizing, but you're giving yourself little points of interest and so forth. Your mind is going to be much more able to fill in the blanks in between those spaces than if you try to just have a complete runway that is filled to the brink. That's not going to happen, but you can have such positions that you can fill in as you go along. So you want to examine books as an object. And what I mean by that, and not just looking at how many chapters it has, but read the back cover, read the front cover, look at it in much more detail than you normally would. See about what's called the colophon page, which has the publisher's information, the dates, the relevant sort of things about its history of publication sometimes. And I really, really recommend not just reading the table of contents, but looking through the index as well. Because the index gives you many, many clues about what might be interesting in that book, what might be important, and what the book covers. So it's almost like a more detailed table of contents. And you want to spend some time just looking at that. I mean, I'm talking not about hours of time examining the book. I'm talking about 5-10 minutes, even less, to get a sense of what it is as an object, how it's been structured, what kinds of things you might expect, so that you're allowing your conscious and your unconscious mind to go ahead of you before you start to go into that book. And if you're not required to read the book, if you're just doing it as part of your own research, I really recommend reading the conclusion. And the reason for that is if the author doesn't come to a compelling conclusion, then you may not want to retrace the process that the author took in order to get to that less than stellar conclusion. And so that's a major point. It's not applicable in all cases, because when you're going for comprehensive knowledge, you do want to sometimes read things that are not so stellar because they're required. But nonetheless, in terms of research, conclusions can be very powerful things. So once you've got the book in your mind, so to speak, established it as an object, you don't necessarily have to close your eyes and reconstruct the book as we do with apples and oranges to get more visual, although you may want to do that as an exercise. You want to make calculations based on the page count and the chapter count, and then think about how many index cards you might want to use. So let's just use the example of 10 cards per chapter and 10 chapters. That would be sort of like 100 cards, which is a bit much, but I just want clean numbers. The next thing to do is to relax. And relaxation is super important when you're doing studying of any kind because it allows your imagination to rise. It helps overcome objections that when you think, oh, this is stupid, or I'm tired, or this is boring, or this isn't interesting to me. All these things are really ego-based. And one thing that really inspired me was Bruce Lee's statement in Enter the Dragon that no self, no enemy. And a lot of us sort of set ourselves up that way when we are encountering information that we need to learn and memorize, is this sort of, it's the enemy, and I need to study it for this particular outcome on a test or an exam or writing an essay. And that's no way to treat information. And that's ego. You're getting your ego in the way. So just relax. And we'll talk a little bit about that more. But in brief, you can just do breathing exercises, be sort of aware of yourself as a machine that breathes and has a heartbeat, and sort of scan your body and just flex your muscles and relax. So you also want to read with your eyes open to the most important points, and knowing your limits. You know that you only have a certain number of index cards that you're going to fill out, and so you read with your eyes open to what's going to jump out at you and what's going to interest you and what's going to be important. And you can also read with your eyes open to your professor or your teacher. What kind of person are they? What kind of things interest them? What might surprise them? What might bore them, but that you can make exciting for them because they might think they know it all and you can show some new angle. So you want to decide in advance that you're going to catch these things. And that will happen a lot easier if you're relaxed. Now, we have already mentioned this, that you prepare your limited set of index cards and you have them with you as you read. This is really a game changer, what you're seeing now, which is how to set up an index card for maximum success. So let's say you've got, to use this clean number, which is of course exaggerated, 100 cards for a book, like a really detailed book. You would have on every single card dedicated to that book the title. And I suggest the top left corner. It's kind of arbitrary to your own style, but somewhere where you can easily see it, the title of that book on every single card. And in this example, the number, each card is numbered. So you would have on each card the number of that card so that you're having the title and the number associated with each other. And then you would have a quote, and it doesn't always have to be a quote, but let's say you have a quote, and then on the bottom right corner you would put the page number of that quote. And this is a organizational strategy. Again, you could have the page number on the right side, or you could have the book title on the right side, whatever you like. Then, when you want to start, I recommend that the first card should always be bibliographical, which is to say that it has the title of the book, it has the author, it has the full title, and it has the translator if there's a translator, and it has the press and the date. And you'll have different bibliographical requirements depending on your teachers. But in this case, I've chosen for this example a book that I have always found fascinating, and it's called Paratext by Gerard Genet, and the subtitle is Thresholds of Interpretation. And so I've got the translator information there, and I've also got the press and the date. And that would be card number 1. And what's really, to me, exciting about all this is that later I can have all the cards that I've extracted from this book in numerical order. Don't need to have them in numerical order for memorization or use later. But I can put an elastic band around them. Actually, elastic bands aren't that great because they decay and then they get all sticky and weird. But a thread works very nicely, and have them gathered together, put in a shoebox, and then you have cards for every book bound together, and you see instantly on the first card what it's called and its bibliographical information. And that's just really game changer for me as a person who does massive amounts of research. Then here's just an example of the second card, which would have the first sort of quote that I want to memorize and just have available in general as part of my extracted knowledge base. And here's just a quote. In the classical period, large formats, quarto, were reserved for serious works, that is, works that were religious or philosophical rather than literary. And I wanted that specific quote rather than just saying important books were big. right? I wanted that specific quote because he's talking about quarto, and that's very important, and he's really getting into the detail of what kind of books, religious, philosophical, and so forth. So in this case, I wanted a specific quote, but it doesn't always have to be quotes. It can also just be ideas that you get as you're reading, and I would recommend you put the page number of where that you got that idea so that you can refer back to it again. So this is sort of an example of an idea card, which is that, as I've written here, Genet's idea of revival through this sort of thing, revival through reissues of books in different formats, reminds me of illustrations disappearing from books in the 19th century thanks to Henry James, and to see another book that I've read called Camilla Elliott's Rethinking. Now, I've just made up this example, but if there was a particular page number in Camilla Elliott's Rethinking, then I would, actually it's called Rethinking the Film Novel Debate, but I've just got Rethinking as the code word there. If there was a specific page number, then I would want to maybe put that page number as well. So this is just a general response that comes from my mind that is also on a card. Now, how are we going to get this stuff into memory palaces? Well, let's say that we had 10 chapters and we had 3 cards per chapter. That's probably a nicer thing for this example. We've seen this image before of this house, and strategically, in creating this example, using fancy technology to get an image of a house and put notes to show you what the stations are in the memory palace, I have strategically placed actually 30 stations in this memory palace. So taking a memory palace and strategically having 30 index cards that I've taken from a book, in this case Jean Genet's Paratext, we can now organize those cards in the order that I want to memorize them. It doesn't have to be linear in the order that I actually collected the cards. It could be in just any order of importance that I have organized. So, for instance, the 10th chapter might be more important and the material from it, so that could come first. And basically, you're going to map out that information on top of the journey. So this is a great sort of strategy. And if you're keeping a top-down list of your memory palaces, you can also use an Excel file, for instance, and have the number of your station in your journeys, the actual name of what the place is in the journey. So 1 would be 1 and tub. We'll see an example of this later. 2 would be the mirror, 3 would be the sink, and so forth. And then you could encode a briefer description of what's on that card and what you're placing there. Now, you want to memorize the information on 1 index card per station. So, and that's not strictly true, but with practice, that's what you'll be able to do. You may need to use 1 or 2 or 3 stations, which is why that you want to obey this rule of being linear in your stations. Because let's say you do need to use 3 stations to memorize 1 piece of information. You're going to want to be able to layer that image that you're creating, this tiny little movie of, say, an alligator kissing a man and the Statue of Liberty whipping them around to create fireworks. That might take you 3 stations. With practice, it shouldn't, but with things like verbatim, like poetry, you will want to use more than 1 station. And if you haven't constructed your memory palace in a linear journey, and your station is here and there, you're not going to be able to do this. You're not going to be able to make a linear movie that you can replay in your mind. But in general, 1 piece of information per station should be quite sufficient with practice. And I would recommend that you not write your associative imagery on the back of your index cards and have it in an Excel file, have it somewhere else if you do need to write it down, which as beginners can be very, very good because it gives your unconscious mind the security that this effort that you're going through to make creative and associative imagery isn't going to be lost in case anything goes wrong. And that's part of relaxing and being relaxed is that you keep a written record. And it really just takes a minute to do. But I suggest that you don't put it on your index cards. And the reason why is because a lot of people just end up falling back into rote learning when they have flashcards. They look at a flashcard, they close their eyes, try to memorize it, then they look back to see if they memorized it. And, you don't want to be doing that sort of stuff. You don't want to have some sort of rote learning methodology. So if you're going to write down your associative imagery, do it somewhere else on an Excel file. And we'll see an example of that later in another lecture. Now, you want to, once you've layered all this stuff down onto the memory palace, we'll get into how this works a little bit more, you want to rehearse that journey. So you've got 30 stations, you've placed 30 pieces of information along that journey of stations, and once you've established that, you want to rehearse it. So you start at the beginning of your journey, and say the number one thing is an alligator, as the example that I've been using. You start with that, you decode it, and you get what it means from the decoding. And then you go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And you want to rehearse in a linear pattern, not so that when you're later trying to recall this under test conditions, you have to start at the beginning and go through to find the piece of information that you're looking for. You just want to rehearse in a linear manner because you're trying to get this material into long-term memory. And so that you just pop to it. You just jump to that particular place. And a lot of people, I was in a discussion recently, just the other day, on mnemotechnics.org, which I invite, well, it's not mine to invite you to, but I recommend that you go and visit it. And we were talking about this sort of effect that happens where merely by going through these procedures, you don't have to go there. You'll have a flash in your mind of the memory palace journey, and you'll sort of have a sense of it, but it's not as if you got to start at the beginning of a journey and then go to this particular place by following the Hansel and Gretel trail of crumbs to find your way out of the witch's oven to get back to your parents. This isn't the case at all. The effect is that you actually just leap to where you need to go because you've gone through these steps, and it's incredibly powerful. So we want to rehearse all of this, and we'll get more into what is involved in rehearsal in a following talk. So to summarize what we've done so far, index cards are really miraculous storage and information retrieval devices. And you can memorize from them easily and use them for writing down ideas and just interacting with information in amazing ways, and then use them for writing later. And you can organize the index cards to match the order of your memory palace. And when you're not even using them for memory palace journeys, do we have a little time for a little story? Stefan? Sure. Yeah. Without even memory being involved, I just would give you a little tip about being able to actually make these even more powerful for writing, which, as I suggested, keeping these together, tied with string in a shoebox or so forth, all the books that you've read. When it came time to write my dissertation, it would be pretty unrealistic to really use all this stuff to try and write in a disconnected manner. So what I did is just imagine being in Manhattan in an apartment looking over the Hudson River and removing all of the furniture from the living room and putting it in the bedroom, and for a period of time that annoyed the person I was living with at the time, I put out the index cards on the floor and put them into the order that I wanted them in order to write my dissertation. And it was incredibly powerful. It took the time of thinking, it made the time of thinking about what I was going to do, how I was going to do it very, very quickly, because here's chapter 1, here's chapter 2, here's chapter 3, here's chapter 4. Wait a second. This point really belongs in chapter 2 from chapter 4, and this point from chapter 10 belongs in chapter 6, and I could just build an outline from index cards, and then later just sit with card number 1 and begin to write. So the application for this is a double whammy. You have the ability to take these cards, look at them, put them into the memory palace, and then you also have the ability later to use them to write an outline in a, let's say, non-linear planning stage that you then turn into a linear piece of prose in chapters and so forth. So I think that's really a time saver. It does seem like it involves a lot of effort and a lot of steps, but once you do it once and you see exactly how efficient this is, it really changes everything. And later, if you're writing books, even blog posts, you can do some research and just organize things. A lot of people love their apps and computers and organizing things this way, but there's something to being able to do this with paper in your hands. And so this is a strategy for getting the material organized and entering information into a memory palace so that you can create the associative imagery. Talk a little bit more about how all that works. But the basic idea is you just see something crazy, and you associate that. You take a piece of information and you see something crazy out of it, in order to create that image that's going to allow you to recall that information. And you're assisting yourself all along the way by having things like index cards as part of this procedure. So it's not memorizing an entire textbook, but it's actually identifying the parts of the textbook that are worth memorizing. So get started, get a book, examine the book and strategize, set limits, gather index cards, fill the index cards strategically. I recommend that you come up with a pattern. You could use the pattern that I've suggested by having the title here, the number of the card there, and the different parts that I talked about. Filling them out strategically is extremely powerful. And then select an appropriate memory palace, recall the material, and we'll get into the actual process of recalling what you've memorized next. So if there are any questions, that is how to realistically memorize a textbook.
He wants to know, this question is also regarding memory palaces again.
Yeah.
Once a particular memory palace has been used for a purpose, can it be used again for a different purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. They're very good at being reused again and again, although different people have different experiences. There's something called ghosting. That's a popular term on mnemotechnics.org, which I mentioned, but incidentally, it's just the major hub. Josh Cohen created an amazing community of people who are interested in memory techniques. It's oriented largely on people interested in competition, but there's just a lot of stuff for people who want application as well. And so the term there is ghosting, and that's the effect of running into stuff in a memory palace that you've memorized before. Myself, I think that's just overthinking it a little bit. You can, or just deliberately getting into your own path, you're just kind of creating an obstruction that you can just clean that memory palace out. If you need to see yourself down on your hands and knees scrubbing those images out, then that's fine. I would never use the word ghosting myself because they seems more like fossils to me. And I like that term fossils because that's a little bit more easy to clean out. And I've done this, actually, this exercise of seeing myself sweeping, scrubbing. And this sort of fossilization is that it's just something that can be readily wiped away. But I often don't go through that. I don't bother with that exercise. I just reuse it. And there are particular memory palaces that I have that are specifically done to be reused. They're designed, by design, they're to be reused. And so you can experiment with setting certain palaces aside, and then you can have certain memory palaces that are specifically designed for long-term use, which then need to be treated in particular ways in terms of recall and how often that you recall material. So yes and no, it has to do with your experience, your practice, what you want, what your goals are. But absolutely, I think that not to overthink it too much. If you want to reuse one, just experiment with cleaning it out, or experiment with just re-memorizing it. Like, you know what a palimpsest is? This sort of piece of paper that's been written on, and then they would scrub the ink away. Well, it would be a piece of vellum in the ancient times. And then they would scrape it away, and you'd still have this after effect of the previous writing. And then they would, write some new stuff. And you would see that, but it doesn't detract from the new writing in any case, in any way. You just have multiple levels of writing on a piece of material. And with practice, as a new person working with this, you may find some distractions, but with practice, it really won't distract you at all. My prediction is, anyway.
Already, could we break down your index card strategy a little bit? Maybe you can go back to the summary on your slides.
This one?
Yeah. Okay, then the next one, please. Yes. No, the next one. No, sorry, in the other direction, towards the end. Mm-hmm. Next one. Yes.
Okay.
So let's start with the first one. So first of all, you're getting a book, right? So here the question arises, how do I select a good textbook?
Well, this has to do with the nature of the assignment. I mean, in many cases, you'll be told what to read.
Right.
So in that case, get that book. Sort of
right.
is what I mean.
But in case I'm an independent learner and I want to become knowledgeable in one certain area, and let's imagine I'm a total greenhorn and I have no prior knowledge whatsoever. How do I select a good introductory textbook about a certain topic?
the question is a little bit vague without guidance into a particular topic, but in general, you need to learn how to assess books, whether they're good or not, as I've suggested, by looking at the conclusion first. That's one way. But I was going to talk about it later, but I'll just mention it now. There's a practice that I developed that I call bibliomancy. And, this is kind of a fun word, but necromancy is this kind of word for magic and these bizarre activities of creating spells and so forth. But biblio, of course, comes from book and library and all these sorts of things. So bibliomancy for me was to go into a library. I love the library at the University of Toronto, which incidentally I did my work at York, but you can apply to be able to use the University of Toronto, and I loved also Scott Library at York as well. And I used to go into these places, use the computer, because the computer has the library, online library functions that show where the books are in the collection are very powerful, and you can learn how to use those. They'll be different from school to school in order to help you narrow down and find books. But of course, that's not foolproof, and you can't completely rely on that. So the practice of bibliomancy actually came from, well, you saw that picture of me earlier before, burdened by all these books. Well, all I needed to read in that particular picture that I wanted to cover was Herbert Marcuse's major work, and I went to the shelf, which is called Negations, and by the way, I went to the shelf and I found Herbert Marcuse's book. I knew exactly what chapter I wanted to read in there, which was the 3rd chapter, and I just looked around the shelf and I thought, what's surrounding this? And I started to look at the different books, and I just started to get piles of books that I was going to examine in order to see, not that they're around there for any particular reason, but begin to see what's around and look through them. Spend some time looking, as I suggested, through conclusions, through chapter headings, through indexes, through the actual bibliographical information that they suggest, because you can see the titles of other books that you'd never find any other way except for looking through other people's bibliographies. The other thing, so that's a process of discovery, of seeing how things are connected and finding good stuff. And it's just it's a bit random. It's combining strategy with randomness and just gathering massive amounts. This is something you can't do online. You can't really collect a bunch of information at once. I mean, you could have all kinds of monitors set up if you have that kind of money and have all things kind of open, but that's not the same as going to a library and collecting piles around you and going through them and then having a strategy for examining those books, such as the one I recommended, with examining it as an object, as I call it. The other thing that I would suggest is getting access to dissertations, because you don't have to read the dissertations, although, again, conclusions, introductions, the chapter titles are very interesting, but you go and look at their bibliographical citations, because typically these dissertations, before they're turned into books, or maybe they're never turned into books at all, they will have much longer and wider and broader and more specific even lists of books and articles and resources that they've looked at, and just scan them. Again, it's a form of bibliomancy. You're just kind of going through it, scanning, looking for something that connects with you. And you begin to build a network of information by just combining randomness with strategy. And this is pre-internet, It's pre-random internet stuff, and you can do it without any internet at all. And it still have a strategy to it that can be tremendously powerful. I guess it's part of being a Renaissance person or something like that, but I love doing that, and I actually came up with a name for it, which is bibliomancy.
My personal question regarding the index cards, I personally have very good experiences with learning with index cards. But the thing that is kind of overwhelming is that I caught myself spending way too much time filling out the index cards, right? I mean, you are reading the book, right, and then you're thinking very hard, what shall I include in the index card, right? And then you're writing, and sometimes, there's so much information, and you're really having a hard time to break it down and to make it crisp. And then I have index cards that are overcrowded, or there's too much text on them. and then it's really a pain to revise them, yeah, because they're not really clear, and you cannot you cannot recall the information with one glance. So, do you have specific advice how to avoid that trap and how to avoid spending too much time on creating those index cards?
I had the exact same problem, and that's why I came up with the idea of, wait a second, I'm spending too much time filling out index cards because I'm coming with a massive stack, and I'm just filling out stuff randomly. Oh, that might be useful later, that might be useful later. And I thought, you know what would happen if I set myself a limit? There are going to be no more than 30 cards out of this book. End of story. Like, I have to get it down in 30, and if that doesn't do it, then there's no more. That's it. Because, people often use the word scarcity mindedness in a lot of different areas, and I think we have that when we study as well. We have this scarcity mindedness that we're never going to have enough, and we need to pile and pile and pile. But the fact of the matter is that if you really can't make knowledge out of 3 points out of a chapter, then you're kind of in trouble. You want to be able to get just the key stuff, and you want to be able to actually memorize that material, have it encoded somehow in a way that launches you into connecting and recalling all the other parts of the chapter or the other more significant stuff. So you actually gain more by less. Just like a sonnet gains more through actually removing possibility, you supercharge it, and your mind actually will fill in those blanks. And you'll have a much greater impression by having a smaller amount of focused impressions. Does that make sense? So my biggest thing is to be disciplined about setting limits and
Right.
be strategical.
But how do you know what's the right amount of number of cards is? I mean, let's say, for instance, imagine you are a math student, right? And as far as I know, in Austria, there is only one very big exam each year, and the average medication curriculum lasts 6 years. So you have one big exam, right?
Mm.
And you have to memorize a crazy amount of books. So the strategy to set limits, like, doesn't really sound appropriate or manageable. How do you cope with high stakes exams that are quantitative so big?
Well, the first thing I would say is, to be perfectly honest, I've not any experience at all in medical school.
Right.
I did English literature, I did media and communications, and I did a PhD in humanities, and specifically in friendship and film. So that's the first thing, is that my advice is coming from that sort of experience and what I came from. However, that said, inside of medicine, as I understand it, there are specific genres. There are specific areas of interest. And in my area as well, there is no clear border. There's no clear border where it begins and ends, but there are genres within it. And you can get a sense of the outer limits and the inner limits. And in the case of medicine, again, I can only speculate, but my intuition and my general understanding of what goes on in these areas is that there are organized genres, and it's a matter of actually just being strategic about it. And if you need to memorize 100 definitions of, say, cellular parts, or let's say you need to memorize not only the names of medications, but also their side effects, what organs they affect, the positive and negative sorts of things that they do to organs and certain outcomes, and connect all that sort of stuff. If you want to be able to manage that, I think the process is the same. You want to be able to go into there with a strategy in how you're going to read, and then you want to actually collect the key points that really first come to your mind as interesting and get going somewhere, and then begin to connect and connect and connect. I had an aunt who did her BA, I still have her, but she did her BA in psychology, and she used to do this sort of stuff, not with index cards, but she would read a book from cover to cover with no notes, nothing. Just read it from cover to cover. And then she would read it again and highlight the stuff. right? So she's building general knowledge, and then she's narrowing down and going down. My suggestion would be something similar of that nature if I had to cover something broad. But it's kind of a challenge that I would like to do. I've always fantasized about being a lawyer. So I think that to really speak directly about that, I'd have to go and do something about it. But in general, I think that when people are, not to corner anyone or point any fingers, but when people are coming up with these kind of, well, it's so much massive amounts of information and so forth, that's kind of putting up a barrier for yourself that isn't real. People do these exams, they pass the exams, and they are able to do it on the basis of comprehensive knowledge. And you also want to, as much as possible, specialize in certain areas. And I think through specialization and interest in specialization, you can more readily gather other pieces of information together from other fields and see the connections because you're focused in a particular area. So, again, I'm sort of speculating without having ever gone to medical school, but...
Okay, got it. On point 5, you're saying select an appropriate memory palace. What does this mean exactly?
Well, first of all, it has to do with a number of available stations within it that you're able to match the amount of material to what can be done inside of that memory palace. It also has to do with your longer-term strategy. So one of the things that I talk about is alphabetizing memory palaces. And is there a way that you can alphabetically create a number of memory palaces that are alphabetized in a strategical way so that if you were dealing with something like medicine, you could have a M memory palace for medication. You could have a palace for anatomy, or even a series of A palaces, A1, A2, A3, A4. And you want to have an appropriate memory palace that fits into those areas. You can also, in terms of being strategical, you can think about whether the memory palace suits in the sense of the theme of the memory palace. Like, is something from your family history going to be as good as something on your campus where you have deep associations with your medical school? Would your girlfriend's house be as good as your doctor's office for things that are, medically related? That's a part of strategy as well, and appropriateness. So, and you can experiment with that. I personally think that myself, it's irrelevant what kind of memory palace it is in many cases, but I think some people would benefit greatly if they're dental students from using their dental office or their dentist's office and maybe even visiting other dentists if that helps them. But I think you should actually work towards having the memory palace appropriate in terms of how many stations it has rather than whether you're using a medical campus to memorize medical stuff. You want to be able to just use it from a cold clinical level in an abstract sense, so to speak, that you can just memorize information and use memory palaces based on how many stations it has.